First off, thank you all for joining. Today's or this month's topic is around Microsoft Teams and whether or not this can fill the role for your unified communications needs. So we appreciate you joining. It should be a good hour. For those who don't know me, my name is Jim Campbell. I'm one of the managing partners here at Opkalla. I'm joined by Chris Brennan and John Paullin, both from the AVANT team, who is our trusted research partner. I think we'll learn quite a bit today from both Chris and John, so thank you guys for joining. I tend to start these before we kind of dig into it. Just for those who don't know who Opkalla is, usually I give about a 30-second just overview on us, and then I'll go through some of the housekeeping. But for those who don't know who Opkalla is, we were created just about 3 years ago, and the goal here was to be a disruptor in the technology selling space. So for us, we find that we have found a gap that end users tend to need a trusted, unbiased technology resource to help make technology decisions. Your day-to-day is very hectic, fighting fires, being strategic to the business. Well, what we've learned is most folks don't have enough time to do the research, talk to all the vendors, to understand the market, learn what technologies both drive their business forward, but also is a good relationship from a vendor to customer standpoint. So that's really the market of which we exist in. And within that space, we really cover a few core areas of where we focus. One is obviously kind of collaboration or unified communication needs. So that could be anything from UCaaS, which we'll talk about today, to CCaaS, to CPaaS, and a number of other as a service models. We help another area is next generation network design. So things like SASE, SD-WAN, some of the mobility and 5G plays, those are all within scope for us. Cybersecurity. So as we know, that's one of the hottest topics in today's kind of buzzwords in space. So cybersecurity for us is we take a very holistic approach. So whether that's outsourced security solutions to endpoint solutions to email secure gateway solutions, we cover the gambit. So please, if you have any questions around that, we'll field those at a later time. And then cloud solutions. So again, we're talking UCaaS, but we're also very proficient around Azure, AWS, GCP, which workloads make sense for your business to go to the clouds and which ones might want to stay put. So all of that. And then lastly, again, with Microsoft Teams in mind, we're a Microsoft Gold partner. So we have a number of experts and engineers on staff to help with your Microsoft needs, whether it's buying licensing, helping just migrate to maybe on-premise to cloud licensing and everything in between. So with that said, I'll stop talking. I want to thank everyone again for joining. I think you guys will find this to be very productive and educational. At that point, or now, I will hand it off to Chris from the AVANT team. But lastly, and I knew I was going to forget this, so there is a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We are going to save about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to address questions. But if questions come up throughout the presentation, by all means, submit them to Q&A. I'll respond saying yes, acknowledge, and then we'll treat them answer them at the end. So with that in mind, Chris, I'll hand it to you and take it away.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the intro, and thank you for Opkalla for involving us on this webinar. So thank you to Elizabeth too, who behind the scenes at Opkalla did a bunch of work to pull this together. So hats off to the Opkalla team. Like Jim said, both John Paullin and myself are here from AVANT, who's basically an extension of the Opkalla team from a research and analytics perspective. We're really agnostic when it comes to vendor and technology evaluation. We try to provide our partners and their prospective customers with our intellectual property and knowledge to help empower them to make the best technology decisions for their organizations today and going forward. Now, we'll get into a little bit more of my background and John's on a future slide, but just want to kind of set the stage here for kind of what we're going to cover. A lot of ground to cover in a fairly short period of time. We'll do introductions. We'll go over kind of the history of Teams, kind of where it came from and its market presence. We'll touch on the licensing structure and pricing. Also get into considerations and some of the gotchas from a functionality perspective of what may or may not be there from a table stakes perspective for those that are familiar with on-premise legacy PBX or even kind of your more robust cloud PBX vendors and UCaaS vendors. And we'll talk a little bit about the UCaaS marketplace and strategies and deployment flavors out there that are options for folks that are trying to figure out a native Teams experience and introduce the PSTN and voice and use it as a PBX. And then we'll kind of give you a kind of quick overview of our Pathfinder demo or dynamic matrices that allows not only Opkalla, but their prospective customers and obviously our engineering team to help vet the market by specific criteria. We can do in seconds what it may take an IT or operations department vetting technology 8 months. So they could be very interested in that. And we'll talk about an IQA towards the end, and then we'll address the questions and answers that crop up in the chat window as we talk. So we'll just dive in here. So quick background on myself. My tenure at AVANT is relatively short. I'm about 2 months into my life here as an AVANT engineer, but I've been in unified communications and contact center for over 20 years, right? So I've spent time at most recently at TalkDesk and Contact. I was part of the roller coaster ride that was Corvisa to ShoreTel to Mitel. Started my contact center and unified communication life at Aspect Software back in the early 2000s in the world of dialers. I don't know if anybody out there remembers the Davox Corporation, but have been in this space for over 20 years and have seen the transition from legacy premise into hybrid and now to cloud. So worked with a bunch of companies, both large, small, and medium in size. And here to share my knowledge, as well as John will share his knowledge as well on UCaaS and CCaaS as it pertains to the Microsoft Teams platform. So I'm going to go to the next slide and let Mr. Paullin do his own intro.
All right, thank you for that. Good to speak with you this afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules for what we hope to be a very insightful webinar. But my name is John Paullin. I have been with AVANT for a better part of 5 years now and have spent essentially that entire 5-year window focusing almost exclusively on cloud UC and cloud contact center. So I have spoken to over 1,000 companies now, I would imagine, over that time span, large and small, different verticals, domestic only, global entities, the like. And I say that not to boast, but just to help hopefully instill some confidence from you and Chris and I in that we have been studying this market for an substantial amount of time. We know the technologies, we know the vendors and kind of the good, bad, and the ugly. And as you can imagine, that Microsoft Teams has been quite a topic of conversation since the pandemic erupted about 18 months ago. So with that said, I will be contributing throughout today's presentation about this talk track, but myself, Chris, and a handful of others here in the AVANT team are well versed in the subject matter, and we're very happy to get on subsequent calls after today's training to talk about your specific situation and to help provide guidance with the Opkalla team as to which might be the best path to go. So with that, I'll step off my soapbox.
Thank you, John. So diving into, we have a lot of ground to cover, and as John mentioned, the topic of Teams comes up in almost every conversation that we have with end users on their strategy as it pertains to voice in the UCaaS world. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight from a historic perspective is this is something that Microsoft has been up to for a while, the whole voice angle, right? Back in Office Communicator in 2007, then of course Lync in 2010, and then Skype for Business in 2015. And it was historically, that against the usual cast of characters in the UCaaS cloud world as it pertains to PBX functionality. And Microsoft, I can say this from a personal opinion perspective, is very good at a lot of different things. But historically, voice hasn't been one of them, but they've come a long, long way, especially when we talk about the lineage here, legacy, and the evolution, right? So the sandbox of usual cast of characters in the UCaaS world remains. Microsoft Teams is born, so to speak, or incubated into a platform at 2019. And, like John said, with the pandemic and everybody trying to figure out how to enable and empower folks to work from home as quickly and easily as possible, Teams has come up quite often and in almost every conversation. Fast forward here to 2021, since Microsoft tends to bundle in with Office 365 Teams, and most people out of the gates, or most organizations, are going to use it for the collaboration piece, which is already turned on with the chat, the IM, the internal voice, and conference and video conferencing. Oftentimes, IT departments or operations organizations look at this platform and say, what would it take to make it my PBX? Like, how do I introduce the outside PSTN to my platform? Now, I think this slide is an awesome depiction of kind of how that snowball we talk about in Teams, Microsoft Teams, rolling down the hill, has gained speed and girth over time. Certainly the number of users has certainly ballooned from a Microsoft perspective. But one of the cool things I think about in this slide is to really kind of hone in on how many of those overall Microsoft Teams users are now monthly phone users, and that 80 million monthly active team phone users as of July 2021. That's pretty impressive, right? So we've been hearing the train coming down the tracks for a while now. We've seen the hockey stick growth up and to the right. And now it's a question of really people peeling back the onions and talking to guys like John or Jim or myself, and really trying to understand, what do we have here? What can it do? How do we use it most effectively and get the maximum bang for our buck out of Microsoft Teams? Anything to add, John? I think that's the kind of the history, the lineage of kind of where Microsoft Teams came from, where it is today, and the adoption of the platform has been pretty staggering.
Yeah, it just speaks to Microsoft's dominance of the desktop. They captured most of the world's operating systems, certainly the vast majority of the productivity tools, and now with Teams being baked into the Microsoft stack and being a tool very heavily relied upon by many organizations during the pandemic, as at the very least an internal collaboration tool, a lot of that Microsoft Kool-Aid was consumed, and that has resulted in a very sticky solution, which has been the end objective for many UCaaS vendors for many years, is to capture the end user adoption or overcome that challenge. So kudos to Microsoft for having done that. But as you're about to see, what it can do is an excellent platform. But when it comes to the phone components of it, there are some potential shortcomings that fortunately we have identified potential vendors that can remedy those or fill those gaps. So
absolutely. All right, so just a quick snapshot. Most of you on the phone call probably very familiar with the platform, but just kind of honing in on the highlighted sections here with the phone handset, and really kind of bringing the PSTN and phone PBX functionality, or turning it on, depending on how you want to look at it, of the Teams platform, is really what we're going to focus our discussion today. We can go very deep, we can go very high level on any number of these slides. I'm going to try and keep it moving along quickly, so it's not death by PowerPoint, but certainly keep in mind at the end of the presentation, you'll have time to ask both John, Jim questions. And I think with the three-headed monster that is us, we should be more than happy or equipped to answer your questions. So I think one of the things that was difficult for me originally, trying to get my head wrapped around the Microsoft Teams enigma, if you will, was really kind of the licensing piece, right? We already talk about Microsoft licensing at the E3 and E5 level. If you have those, what does it take to turn on the PBX or phone portion of Teams? There's certainly a couple of components. If you're dealing directly with Microsoft, what you need to add to an E3 license, which is depicted here in this slide. There's actually a phone system license, which is an additional $8. And then the audio conferencing license, which is additional $4 to kind of make the E3 license Teams phone ready, if you will. But keep in mind, you're kind of building the car, but you still kind of need gas in the car to make it go. So even in the E3 or E5 license levels, you're going to need a Microsoft calling plan in and on top of that licensing so that you can enable the domestic and international calling. And, there are pooled minutes. They segment it out. It's also on the slide from a domestic of 1,200 pooled minutes or 3,000 pooled minutes at $8 and $12 respectively. But also there's an international component. A lot of companies, obviously, that operate here domestically are going to do some international calling, or if there's international companies, being able to call outside of your country is paramount sometimes to business success. And at last check, I think me and John were chatting earlier about the number of countries that Microsoft can service in these calling plans has risen, but it's up to 33, which is certainly significant. I read an old report from a couple of years ago where it was 16, but now to be able to service 33 countries with their international calling plans, and in knowing Microsoft and how they operate and the whole innovation kind of parabola, if you will. I guess parabola is the wrong one because that parabola eventually goes down. But the life cycle of innovation, they'll be adding more coverage as they go forward. But 33 is kind of where they sit today. But the licensing, if you're dealing directly with Microsoft, has some layers and components to it. E5 does include the phone systems license as well as audio conferencing license. But you can see where, based on your baseline spend from a licensing perspective, it can grow pretty quickly to one that, if you're measuring it against a standard UCaaS license of an agent per month, can be pretty significant when you kind of factor in all the different piece parts to the puzzle, right? So just kind of letting you know kind of how that rounds out, giving you a visual representation of kind of the licensing components when dealing directly with Microsoft. It's not kind of a one size fits all scenario. There's E5, you're adding calling plans. E3, you're adding those two different other license components and calling plans, and that can really kind of compound the cost of your Microsoft licensing. Anything else to kind of to sprinkle in there from a color commentary perspective, John?
Just that the audio conferencing license you're seeing there, from this point forward, it does not have anything to do with the phone component of Microsoft Teams. That is simply a license that's needed for anybody that wants to host a Teams meeting that has a conference bridge included. But you do not need to have the phone system license. You certainly do not need to have a calling plan per se. It is for meetings that, instead of just joining strictly over VoIP, to have something that a remote entity can dial into. And it's important to note that that $4 conference license and the cloud phone system license are baked into E5, but using the analogy Chris has made, that gives you the car, but you need the gasoline.
Yep.
And Microsoft is one flavor of gasoline, it's BP, but we're about to talk about Shell and Marathon and others.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, John. So bringing PSTN calling to Teams, what are your options? What can you do? What are your menu items, so to speak, right? You can certainly, as mentioned, buy everything from Microsoft, right? More expensive than UCaaS typically. We talked about the licensing and the layers. A lot of onus on the customer from a maintenance and support perspective. There's an SLA that we'll talk about kind of throughout this presentation of 3 nines and what you need to obtain that SLA or make it valid or certified. You also can do it yourself, direct routing, right? You do it, the direct routing component, but what that would entail if you were to do it is versus using managed direct routing and a third party or like a UCaaS vendor that is a direct routing partner with Microsoft. And then also the embedded dialer, right? What's that mean? What does that bring to me from a native Teams experience perspective? What's involved in that? And we'll kind of go through these as we go through this presentation. Again, if you have any questions, we're going to have time towards the end. But things to consider really from a dial plan perspective when it comes to Microsoft and dealing with Microsoft directly. One of the things I will mention is there are some hyperlinks within this presentation. We're happy, we've already provided the entire presentation to Opkalla, and they're welcome to share that out so that folks can click on these different items and the hyperlinks with URLs to get the specific things that are mentioned in the slides. But like we said, we're going to talk about some of the things in Microsoft that might be absent today. But like any other great software company, Microsoft has a roadmap. They're going to continue to add and innovate feature functionality into Teams as it matures. So what we talk about today might not be true in 6 months or a year or 18 months for that matter. So there is a published Microsoft roadmap that you can have access to. There's a link here. But we did mention earlier on the previous slide the SLA, right? 3 nines is not the best SLA out there. Obviously, it's kind of a be talking about UCaaS vendors. I know UCaaS vendors like 8x8 have a 5 nines SLA, which means the amount of downtime or the availability of the platform over a period of time, in particular a year. When you go from 3 nines to 4 nines to 5 nines, that's significant time where that platform may or may not be available to you in your business. So is that 3 nines threshold, and what that means from a maintenance window or downtime perspective or availability perspective, is that a threshold that your organization can live with or not live with, right? It's certainly something to be considered. And when validating or certifying an SLA, it has to be a certified Microsoft handset wired Ethernet, all right? So if it is not that configuration or setup, that 3 nines SLA is not guaranteed. We also mentioned kind of previously international coverage is still progressing. As of November 2021, this month, 33 countries that are in scope and coverage for them from an international calling plan perspective. Again, there's a link here to refer to their country list, and as obviously it will grow over time. Analog device support also requires knowledge of direct routing. You'll come to find that a lot of these kind of either do-it-yourself or work with Microsoft scenarios requires you have some in-house knowledge or Microsoft certified staff to be able to do what they need to do with the platform and Microsoft, or you can lean on somebody like an Opkalla, right, that has that expertise on staff and can provide that to you. Anything else?
Yeah, Chris, I got a question for you, and I don't know if I'm skipping slides, but I think the talk track for us and maybe just the general industry was Microsoft didn't necessarily want to be the phone provider, the PSTN provider for a long, long time, right? Even the last 18 months, we would maybe argue that was the case.
Yep.
Is that changing now that they're countries? And, the SLA thing for me or for us seems to be a big one. I think that needs to potentially improve. But do you feel like Microsoft is really trying to put their foot, compete with the big guys and really stand on stage to say, hey, we want to be your sole provider? Or again, maybe you're talking about this in a further slide, but I guess that would be a question that we get often. I'm curious your thoughts on it too.
Yeah, I mean, in my personal opinion, I think like any good software company, the forefront of their strategy is oftentimes land, command, and expand, right? As it pertains to customer opportunity. So do they want to be the end all be all? There's certainly profit and revenue in that form. So from a strategy perspective, I think you look at dipping your toe in the water if you're Microsoft to see how it goes. It seems to be having some out of the gate, some great success. And like any other for-profit public company, if there's profits to be made for stockholders, they'll expand and continue to build and innovate. I mean, Microsoft's been a really solid software company for a long, long time, and being able to innovate and, change their stripes to a certain extent or expand into areas where they haven't previously been the legacy dominating vendor certainly bodes well for them. I think that the UCaaS competitive landscape always kind of shakes in their boots when they see somebody of the size and breadth of Microsoft point their guns at something. And if that's the case, people have worked really quickly to have some kind of bridge or gap integration with Teams, but it's hard to say what the future will hold. Microsoft is there's very bright people over there doing very brilliant things, right? So I don't know, John, would you add your opinion to that answer to that question?
I would say that, I mean, they're definitely trying to expand to become an option for, you know, those companies that really want to go all in on the Microsoft Kool-Aid. Prior to this international expansion, the majority of companies, as in about 85% that were exploring Microsoft Cloud Phone System, chose to go the direct routing path because they found that the the Microsoft system with Microsoft calling plans insufficient for what they were possibly coming off of in terms of like a Cisco or an Avaya system. So it's been viewed as an SMB play, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you have very simplistic telephony needs, excuse me, the Microsoft calling plan option, you know, is one that could be attractive. But I do point back to that SLA because you're putting all of your eggs into that SLA in that question. So I think Microsoft is more concerned with, let's just get the technology, the Teams application on as many desktops worldwide. And if we can capture some amount of that revenue with our own calling plans, great. But if we are, you know, by developing this direct routing framework, allowing companies to bring in their own carrier, as long as they're using our application and as long as we're selling the licensing necessary to turn Teams into a phone system, that's their main objective. It's been explained to me repeatedly, and I'll try to follow up on this yet again, but it's my understanding that Microsoft reps are not even compensated on the Microsoft calling plans. So there isn't, and they are compensated, of course, in all other licensing, but if they're not being incentivized to sell their own calling plans, then, you know, that tells me they're not necessarily trying to dominate the corner of the market. Yes, they're not trying to corner the market to be the single global company. They maybe want to be the single global platform, but allowing other companies to bring that, because again, out of that 33 countries, that's only a small percentage of the countries in the world.
Right.
You know, they're not going to be able to cover everybody. So,
yeah, cool. And one of the, you know, just to kind of circle back to the slide here, one of the final points I'll make here is, you know, the technical support question, right? I mean, who handles the technical support for Microsoft? It's not the easiest thing in the world to go find a technical resource by going to their website, or 800 number to find somebody that's going to help you with or recreate an issue in a lab to help you rectify a technical challenge. Right?
Yeah, I think those are use cases we're going to talk to, and maybe even with the Q&A that we could always spitball to is valuable, right? Because every Teams deployment we've done, whether that's a direct route, and for those who don't know, I think we'll explain it shortly, but whether that's direct route or Teams specifically, just understanding some of the shortcomings and, hey, who's going to service this? How do you get here? You know, what countries are important to you? Those use cases, I think, will ring true and relevant for the listeners or for the attendees. So,
yeah. So one of the things that this is actually a Microsoft drawing, right, from Microsoft themselves, that really kind of depicts that direct routing architecture. One of the things that I like to draw people's attention to in this diagram is in that center box under number 3 in the bottom right-hand corner, it mentions a third-party PBX, right? You know, so they know that their offering has some table stakes shortcomings as far as feature functionality is concerned for folks that have come from the likes of a Cisco or an Avaya or even a Ring Central or a Vonage or an 8x8 as far as a robust UCaaS or on-premise PBX solution to kind of fill those functionality gaps, right? And this is kind of really the architectural flow. You'll actually see a very similar diagram in a future flavor of deployment that we'll mention on a future slide. But this is from Microsoft's webpage. It really kind of depicts that direct routing architecture, which seems to be the route that most people are going when it comes to trying to achieve a native Teams experience, but still get all the kind of nooks and crannies of feature functionality that they've grown accustomed to over time with a standard PBX. Right. Now, this slide is designed for your eyes to roll back in your head. It is purposely wordy because it talks to what it takes to do it yourself from a direct routing perspective. Everybody loves do-it-yourself shows. Everybody likes to build their own, wooden tables or what have you. But this really kind of runs through all the different piece parts to doing direct routing yourself as the end user. And I draw your attention to the right side of the screen, where the very first component is the equipment licenses. From an SBC perspective, can be pretty daunting right out of the gates for 60 grand before you even start talking about the end user licensing. And then you wrap around that base equipment cost, user licensing, then the setup, right? Know that your time and your employees' times are things that need to factor into these business cases of which direction you go in. To sort of set it up, certainly your own with your own people has a cost associated with it. And then bringing in SIP trunking from a specific provider of your choice, like a level 3 or an IntelliPeers, Windstream, Sprint, etc. Porting of your phone numbers is on the shoulders of the customer, right? Now, if you as a client were thinking of going the direct Teams route to get out of the business of managing telephony and PBX, this is not the route for you, because it's a 6 of one, half dozen of another, to use a cliche. It's a dog with fleas, so to speak. Probably the wrong analogy, but there are different piece parts to this deployment model that fall directly on the shoulders of the client from a cost or people expenditure perspective. And then think about the ongoing maintenance, right? Software patches and maintaining all the different components from the SBC hardware, whether that's you're managing that directly or you've got a partner or a managed service provider that's managing an SPC for you. It can be pretty daunting a process or a project to take on. Anything Jim or John you want to add to kind of this approach?
No, I'm good on my side.
Okay.
No, just that, again, there's not a single provider out there that's going to be able to address every country. So if there is an audience member here that does have an office in particular countries that you're concerned about whether there is a service provider available to provide a direct routing solution and all the equipment you're seeing here in order to facilitate that, let us know what those countries are, and we can help you identify where there might be a need for a managed SBC, perhaps provided by the direct routing vendor, but then that's just the equipment. You may need to contract with a local carrier in region in order to have calling in select countries. So this model may still be applicable, but fortunately, the process for deploying direct routing is very well documented. You do need to have the skill set for it, but as a managed services offering from those direct routing as a service vendors who maybe are able to address 90% of your sites, they can certainly help you with something like this in a country that they cannot address.
Yep. Good point. So just to kind of quickly review some of the features that may or may not be present in the Teams standard functionality that one might have grown accustomed to with a standard PBX, either premise or cloud. They do have auto attendance and hunt groups, but maybe not as complex or robust as you might need or have grown accustomed to on a Avaya or a Cisco or a RingCentral or what have you. They don't offer out of the box PSTN call recording. Like if we're call recording and capturing the audio exchange between your business phone users and the customers are paramount for legal reasons or what have you, that's a challenge in the Teams environment. It does not come within the SMS out of the box. It can be added through a third-party vendor. There are no contact center features as part of the Teams baseline functionality out of the box. Oftentimes they cannot service or accommodate intercom and paging. There is a CNAME limitation, or otherwise known as outbound caller ID. There's oftentimes in the Teams world a universal outbound caller ID that's presented on the far end when someone's receiving a call. If you have multiple branches, multiple locations, multiple divisions, and you wanted to outpulse a different outbound caller ID depending on where the call is originating from within the organization, whether it's a branch or a department, you are limited in your ability to do that in Microsoft Teams. It's kind of a one size, one shoe fits all. You get one universal CNAM, and that's what's outpost on the outbound caller ID. And as well as there's no faxing support out of the box from a Microsoft Teams perspective. And these are oftentimes these features that are overlooked during customer evaluations. Sometimes these are things that crop up after the fact. I thought it worked like this, or I assumed this was present in the platform. And to find that post installation, post go live is never a pleasant situation. So know that going in, there's a nice little kind of menu list out on the right hand side of the slide as far as features that are there versus aren't there. Just never be shy to involve your Opkalla team, or if they can involve us as well to make sure that we're uncovering and turning over every rock in the evaluation success criteria phase of deciding where to go a certain route with the technology. Please feel free to lean on us and we'll help you in any way possible. Like I mentioned, SMS is not present within the Teams platform, but you can add it. The depiction here, the screenshot here shows you adding SMS to a native Teams type experience with the Vonage wrapper is one of the vendors that offers an SMS solution that can be embedded within Teams. So these things that aren't natively there can certainly be added. Now, here's where kind of we get to the meat of the presentation as to what are your options for voice in Teams. And I'll kind of let the automation play out here, but we call this, and John affectionately refers to this as the 27 flavors of vanilla, right? You can have the managed direct routing with a bundled PBX and what that all comes with, and what some of the issues that addresses from the out of the box team stuff. You can do managed direct routing with no PBX. There's a call to team options. There's embedded dialer and on-prem hybrid if you're trying to basically transition away from an on-premise PBX like an Avaya that hasn't depreciated from the original CapEx investment. And maybe you're still trying to amortize a couple of years of the cost of that original CapEx outlay for 2 or 3 more years, but you still want to use Teams. There's that kind of bridge on-prem hybrid option for you there. But here, we're going to go through each one of these individually. But one of the things that I love to do is click this automation, because as a client trying to navigate the very confusing vendor waters of making a technology decision, here are the vendors that play in each one of these sandboxes or buckets, right? And you'll see certain vendors appear in more than one bucket. So who does what well, who will get me to my perceived future state or utopia from a technology perspective when talking about UC and my organization, right? That's what Opkalla and AVANT are here to help you with, right? So from the first one out of the gate, the managed direct routing for the bundled PBX. If you look at this particular slide, it looks a whole heck of a lot like the Microsoft slide I showed you earlier. But in this case, that third-party PBX is that Evolve IP component. Now, we chose at random certain vendors to throw in there. There is obviously more than just Evolve IP that can deliver this functionality, but just as a matter of discussion, we put Evolve IP into that technological architecture draw, and then kind of show you what it provides in the Microsoft Teams platform in this architectural drawing. It is that third-party PBX in this case that's going to fill some of those functionality gaps that aren't native to Teams out of the box, right? So they're going to have the certified session border control. They're going to have that maybe receptionist app from an Evolve IP perspective that's not present in the Teams feature functionality. They do offer call recording. You can give you that native Teams experience, but also fill the gaps with the feature gaps with the functionality from Evolve IP, right? And still use your Teams window or interface to do your day-to-day calling, but it's Evolve IP behind the scenes that are kind of filling those gaps. And also with this architectural drawing, we kind of give you an idea of what is still required from a license perspective, right? You know, the E5 license has everything included, required, or you could have an E3 and add that the phone systems license. You're going to require a UCaaS seat, which could be anywhere between, you know, $10 to $15 to $20 a month. Native Teams dialer. So just kind of gives you an idea of direct routing with that third-party PBX. We see a lot of this. Probably not the quite most popular option chosen by customers, but very common. Anything you want to add, John or Jim?
Well, Chris, just, and correct me if I'm wrong, but something I think the users need to know and maybe decipher from each of these options is, in this third-party PBX, the end user would have no idea if it was Microsoft behind the scenes or if it was Evolve or whoever it is, meaning there's no indication that it's anything other than a Microsoft interface.
Yeah, it's that native Teams experience with someone behind the curtain providing functionality that kind of fills those gaps.
Yep.
Correct. Yep. Absolutely. So I know we're kind of running short on time, so we're going to kind of plow through this stuff so we can make sure we have time for questions. There's certainly give John a couple of minutes to kind of go through the dynamic matrices demo. Direct routing without third-party PBX, according to John in our discussion, this is the most popular route from customer choice perspective. No third-party PBX in this scenario, and you're basically, you know, you're getting SIP trunking to get to the PSTN. Where if you use a company like Masergy per se, you might need 1,000 licenses from Masergy and Microsoft, but you know their SIP trunking might be based on an Erlang calculation and based on how many users might be on a concurrent call at a particular time. But this is pretty straightforward from a design perspective. Again, mentioning on the right-hand side of the slide, kind of the license requirements, what is required, what isn't required. And again, we will certainly provide you the presentation after the fact. Anything else, John, you tend to add on this particular flavor of deployment that's worthy of note?
Sorry, as I unmute myself there. Yeah, this is, I guess, kind of the purest form of direct routing in that there is no third-party PBX as part of that diagram, and as the title of the slide indicates. As a result, the price points tend to be a little bit more aggressive, as you're seeing on the right. You still need that Microsoft phone system license. But when there is a potential hiccup with Microsoft Teams, the direct routing vendor can still remote call forward your key numbers offsite to another destination.
Survivability, yep.
But in the previous example where there is a third-party PBX, one of the options customers who go with that model could choose to adopt would be to use the native UCaaS vendor's soft phone as a backup endpoint in case Teams goes down. But under this model, it's in effect, it's outsourced SBCs with the managed services wrapper included, and then the dial tone provided by the direct routing vendor to voice enable Teams. But you kind of get what Teams gives you and maybe nothing more. Yep. But while this is very similar in appearance to the Microsoft calling plan, this is what we're saying before. If you go the Microsoft calling plan route, that's fine, but all your eggs are in the Microsoft basket. There may not be the option to forward your calls to your Microsoft phone numbers to another location, whereas your direct routing vendor is going to have control over its voice infrastructure that's independent of Teams. Teams goes down, they can at least, direct your phone numbers that's hitting their infrastructure to another destination.
Yep. Cool. Now the third option here of call to Teams is one I think that there's a company called Qnify that their product is called Call to Teams. And if you look, I don't know if you can see my the double-ended arrow between 8x8 and Microsoft 365. Think of that the media, the call to Teams Unify media server would reside, kind of the middleware, if you will, that is kind of that handshake or hand in glove between the UCaaS vendor, which in this particular example is 8x8, and Microsoft kind of is the go-between between those two cloud platforms, right? There used to be a $5 surcharge as part of this deployment model that has gone away. That's why you see a red slash through the $5 a month option here. But certainly, I know that the UCaaS vendors that do this particular model aren't advertising the go-between call to Teams, but are certainly delivering a native Teams solution with that particular third-party vendor in the mix. It's a successful deployment model. Certainly, when there's more vendors in the mix of a solution, there's always a potential for finger pointing, but this one seems to be free of that almost with the deployments that we have worked with and talked about with certain UCaaS vendors that use this deployment model. But certainly one that's successful and worthy of consideration, but still giving you that whole native Teams experience, living and breathing within that Microsoft Teams environment. Moving on to embedded dialer. This is an interesting one. It really, this particular approach allows the Teams user to download an application, typically from a UCaaS vendor. I think in this particular example is Fused, that when you actually need to make an outbound call, there's the Fuse or UCaaS provider soft phone is presented. You dial, and when you execute the dial, hit that call button. Teams is minimized, and to the forefront of your browser or your workstation is that UCaaS soft phone, and you make and receive calls with that application that can be gotten through the Microsoft App Store. You certainly don't need the licensing considerations here to the right. Not applicable from an E5 perspective. You will need that UCaaS seat from that UCaaS provider, in this case Fuse, and it does kind of talk to, it's kind of an easy way to kind of snap in the ability to the outbound and inbound dial as kind of a Teams add-on. With it, not quite the native Teams experience that you're going to live and breathe everything within that Teams platform. There is that soft phone application that you're using to make and receive phone calls, but still a viable solution for consideration when you're kind of doing cost-benefit analysis of what's going to work for you and your organization. Okay. The last one, and moving right along here, because I know we're running short on time, is the one I mentioned kind of briefly earlier, was that on-prem hybrid solution, as if you were migrating or slowly moving away from a premise PBX like an Avaya, Cisco, on-premise PBX that hasn't quite fulfilled its let's see, amortized plan for the original CapEx layout, and you need to stick around for another year or two or have it be part of the transition plan from premise to cloud. There are options there as well. In this particular example, we're talking Scipio as the vendor that's providing this particular solution, but keep in mind that there are integration fees that go along with this. This can be fairly cost prohibitive when you start and get down to the individual case basis components to get your existing premise PBX platform to work and handshake in with Teams and have it work seamlessly and be able to map phone numbers from the historic PBX to Teams users. There's a lot that goes into the consideration and execution of this particular model. John, anything to add to that before I move on?
The other thing I would just add is it tended to be a temporary state to give you a roadmap to start peeling off users and departments from your legacy system to Teams, but still facilitate some sense of a uniform calling plan so that Teams users can reach their Cisco colleagues and vice versa. Yep. And in some instances too, if you're thinking about it, this is a third-party PBX that is working alongside Teams. So it could fill that third-party PBX a section of the diagram to, you set up your auto attendants and your hunt groups, continue to maintain those on your Cisco system. And then if the end destination happens to be a user that's been migrated to Teams, because you have a service provider that's kind of, helping to keep all the stuff glued together, they can assist with routing those interactions to the right user, even though they're on Teams. But ultimately, the idea is that you're going to eventually sunset that on-premises system or shrink it, because most of the human beings can get by in Teams, and maybe you retain some of the legacy infrastructure for devices that maybe aren't a good fit for Teams, or because you have some application integrations that you don't want to break.
And as mentioned earlier, there is no native contact center functionality in the Teams out of the box. But you can certainly add CCaaS functionality with a third-party vendor. The one that's depicted here is nice in contact, and you see where in the bottom left-hand corner where that nice icon lives and breathes within the Teams purview, providing you with the contact center components. Contact center is clearly important to a lot of companies out there because it is the front door to the organization. It's where the company interacts and works with their clients, whether it's sales, tech support, customer service, etc. So being able to use CX or customer experience as a competitive differentiator is a big thing for a lot of companies. So the addition of this feature functionality can be key, but certainly things to consider. It doesn't exist. We have basic call queues, but no skills-based routing or multiple modal digital channel support. There are obviously evolving CCaaS vendor integrations. Directory is one of them. One of the presence within the UI, right? Being able to know if somebody's busy or not busy, and consult with agents via Teams as well. So there are some parts to contact center that can be added on or layered on to the Teams deployment. But potential caveats, there are some API limitations, application protocol interface. So what you can and can't do in talking to and from Teams from a CCaaS vendor to the Teams platform. And then the direct routing implementation costs as well are considerations. So, I want to just leave some time obviously for questions and for a quick demo from John on Pathfinder and the dynamic matrices. But this is really a summation of what we talked about today, captured in 4 quick takeaways. I'm not going to read them verbatim. I'm sure everybody out there is more than literate and doesn't want me reading them bedtime stories in the form of key takeaways. And again, we will provide you this presentation so that if you're taking notes or even screenshots at this point, don't worry about it. You'll have this collateral at your leisure when you want to review it or revisit it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the baton to Mr. Paullin to do a quick Pathfinder demo, and then we should have at least around almost 5 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oops.
I'll try to make this pretty concise here.
We don't have any questions yet, guys. So, I mean, we'll be mindful of time, but right now we're fine.
Okay, cool.
All right. As soon as they start trickling in, let us know. But so this is a service portal known as Pathfinder that our collective teams use for a variety of different purposes. It has a vast amount of information about a vendor portfolio, and you'll see here that the vendor portfolio is quite substantial as it renders here. If you want to get to know a little bit about, let's click on 3C Logic. Maybe it's a company you haven't heard about. Here are some battle cards, which are standardized templates that every one of our vendors will fill out. There's some case studies, marketing material, and then of course some key contacts there. So we have a lot of information about the suppliers, and I'm going to have to be pretty concise here and focus on the stuff related to Teams in particular. But one of the things that we love to show are related to Teams. You've been hit with a lot of information here today. Architectures, licensing, who's a CSP, who is, who's a good global option, who is not. And what we've been doing is continue to evolve these various matrices that we have in different technology stacks. So not just cloud, UC, or Teams, but you can see there's quite a substantial list here. And forgive me for showing off a little bit, but we want you to know that while this is a Teams webinar here, we are able to assist in a variety of different capacities. But focusing on Teams, we're going to click on the UCaaS button here. And we have our original UCaaS matrix. We have ones on features, on network, and then what do you know? Here's one on Microsoft Teams. Now, these are dynamic matrices in that the criteria here that you can select is going to shift the names. You know, for example, if I click on Operator Connect or not, that's going to shift the names. It's almost like a little RFI tool. You could choose some different architectures. Perhaps today led you to be more inclined to explore those that have a bundled PBX capability. We want to look at those that have international coverage. Maybe we want to source our Microsoft licensing directly from them because we have E3 today, but we're going to need that cloud phone system license. Maybe it would be in our best interest to source that from the same company that's going to help us provide those dial plans. In any event, I'm going to go ahead and generate this matrix. And again, you can see it is like in RFI. These are the vendors, and let me blow this up, oops, a little bit here to make it easier to see. But these are the vendors that checked most of those boxes. And there'll be pages here where you can click to launch one of those pages I showed you about those particular vendors. This is going to tell you about their architecture, and we have a little legend here as to what these different architectures mean. Because if you forgot after today's webinar, and that's understandably so, you know, what is direct routing versus BundledPBX? We try to spell it out here as clearly as we can here on the side. You'll be able to see whether they're a member of Operator Connect. That's not something we talked about here today, but just know that Microsoft is starting to streamline the direct routing implementation process, which is admittedly pretty PowerShell heavy, a lot of command line stuff right now. Operator Connect is going to be the future version of that. And some companies already have that capability, others do not. We'd be happy to take you through a subsequent training and tell you more about that. But you're able to filter on those. You can see how many countries a particular vendor is able to service in terms of full PSTN replacement and how we're defining that. Again, these are the CSPs. Not every entity here is one that is comfortable or authorized to sell their calling plans into the Microsoft government data centers. Maybe it's just GCC or GCC High or the Department of Defense. So you can filter based on those kind of things. So this is something we are happy to show you again in greater detail. These can be exported, so you have plenty of information, and just know that we are continuing to add not only suppliers, but additional rows and data points here so that you're able to, hopefully leverage this tool to quickly shortlist a number of applicable vendors, because we are a time multiplier. Let us do the research and save you the headache of having to Google search Microsoft Teams direct routing vendors and you get a laundry list, and it's hard to distinguish one from the other.
Yeah,
so that is.
Hey, real quick, and I know we're running up on time, but we have a question came in, said, if my desire is to have a native Teams experience, is there an advantage to choose call to Teams over direct routing or vice versa?
The call to Teams and the BundledPBX architectures are fundamentally identical. The difference being those that check this box have chosen to deploy and manage and own that Microsoft certified session border controller infrastructure. Whereas call to Teams, this was a strategy employed by many of the legacy UCaaS vendors. They partnered with call to Teams because it has a series of Microsoft certified SBCs deployed globally, as well as a convenient middleware that has automated a lot of that PowerShell work necessary to take your Microsoft tenant and have it speak to a direct routing vendor. But the call to Teams architecture, really, we are only mentioning it just as a material fact that there is a third party involved. we've seen no concerns with the architecture in terms of outages or finger pointing. And that's part of the reason why in the slide that we showed that came from 8x8, they omit that diagram of call to teams in the picture. And it's because it can muddy the water, but I don't want you to be concerned about it. Just know that it is a third-party entity, but it will give you many of the same benefits as a third-party PBX because they are including a third-party PBX. They're just renting the SBC that glues their cloud to Microsoft's.
And last, and I know we're running out, but the one other piece of the puzzle that I thought that might need to be noticed for some of these bundled PBX players, is there any more innate business continuity type features that would come with the bundled PBX offering versus a call to teams? Or does that not make a difference because depending who the vendor is, they might have that redundancy already?
Yeah, again, the call to teams in the bundled PBX model, the key difference is in call to teams, there's an outsourced SBC that's owned by a third party. But both a CBTS who offers a bundled PBX model, so they own the SBC and they're bundling in their BroadSoft PBX, versus a RingCentral who partners with call to teams but is also bundling in their PBX. What that can do from a business continuity standpoint is, as we described before, you may be answering most of your phone calls in the Teams client. However, if Teams goes down, there is the option for you as a customer to forgo buying Microsoft Teams certified handsets that only communicate to the Microsoft cloud, and instead go with your run-of-the-mill Poly or Yealink handsets that are standard out there in the market and that have been sold by RingCentral and CBTS forever. But those handsets would register directly to the third-party PBX of the direct routing vendor, meaning that when a phone call comes in under normal working conditions, your Teams client and that handset will ring. If Teams goes down, however, that handset will still function because it is completely independent of the Microsoft environment. So it does give you a little bit more business continuity, the bundled PBX, because that third-party PBX is there, and unless it goes down alongside Microsoft's cloud PBX, which I've never heard of, you have the option to log into that UCaaS vendor's native soft phone or have a desk phone provided by them that would still ring in the event of a Teams outage. I know that can be clear as mud. We may need a second conversation, but
yeah, I think that's the point here is that I for the remaining attendees, and I know we've gone a few minutes over, this isn't a conversation you make a decision on after, you know, one discussion, one scoping call, right? This takes time. From all the implementations we've done, this takes some strategy. It takes some thinking how your users might want to use their handsets, if they want handsets, if soft phones are fine, right? So I think as in closing, there's two things we're going to do. We're going to send you the recording of the webinar. We're going to send you an interactive quick assessment. So essentially about a 5-minute survey around your voice today. So whether that's an on-prem PBX, if you want to move to a UC platform, we've bundled probably about 15 to 20 questions into about a 5-minute survey that helps tell the story of your environment today. So all this to be said is if there is engagement, if there is a need or interest, it will be on the Opkalla team to field these IQAs, reach out to you. We'll make sure that we follow up with thank you notes, etc., and then coordinate calls that Chris or John might still be on anyways, but just to get the dialogue further started. So with all that said, Chris, John, any closing thoughts, or should we are we good to shut it down?
Yeah, I just want to, nothing else from me. I just want to thank everybody for their time and opportunity and taking time out of the busy day to listen to us. I think there's a lot of content here, but I think it's just the beginning of the conversation.
Yep. You good, Johnny?
No closing remarks. We just know that we're here to help. Again, this is just we're just scratching the surface into this topic, but we're happy to dive into your unique circumstances on subsequent conversations. So please reach out to Jim and the Opkalla team, and we'll be happy to help.
Yep. Well, thank you all for joining. We appreciate it, and we'll be in touch, but hope everyone has a good rest of their day and week. And if we don't talk, have a good Thanksgiving.
Thanks, Jim.
Well,
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Elizabeth.